For the last 30 years, if you wanted to grow a vegetable, everyone told you the same thing. Get some good soil, dig it, feed it, and plant into it. That's the rule. That's gardening 101. I've said it myself in probably 100 videos on this channel. But here's the thing. That rule isn't actually true, not in the way most people think it is. This tomato right here never touched soil, not once. No dirt, no compost, no potting mix with organic matter in it. Nothing you'd recognize as soil in the traditional sense. And this one? Grown the normal way, in a raised bed with good compost-enriched soil. Can you tell which is which just by looking at them? I couldn't either, and I grew both of them myself. So today I want to actually prove something a lot of gardeners don't want to hear. Soil is not the magic ingredient. It's not the thing that makes plants grow. What plants actually need is much simpler than that, and once you understand what it is, you can grow food in places you never thought were possible. Balconies, garages, tiny apartments, places with contaminated or terrible native soil, even in areas with almost no water to spare. I'm going to walk you through exactly what a plant actually needs to survive and thrive, show you 4 completely different soil-free growing methods I've tested with my own hands, take you through the results, the good, the bad, and the stuff that surprised me. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to start growing without soil yourself, even if you've got zero experience and zero backyard space. Let's get into it. Let's start with the belief itself, because I think understanding why we all assume soil is essential is actually the key to unlearning it. For basically all of human agricultural history, soil was the only practical way to grow food at scale. You didn't have plastic, you didn't have pumps, you didn't have LED grow lights or precision nutrient dosing. You had dirt, and dirt happened to contain more or less by accident most of what a plant needs. So soil became not just a growing medium, it became synonymous with growing itself. Put it in the ground, and grow a plant became the same sentence in most people's heads. But here's what soil actually does for a plant broken down into its real functions, because once you separate these out, the whole picture changes. Function 1, physical support. Soil holds the plant upright, roots anchor into it so the plant doesn't fall over or blow away. Function 2, water retention and delivery. Soil holds moisture in its structure and releases it to the roots over time so the plant isn't constantly drying out. Function 3, nutrient storage and delivery. This is the big one people focus on. Soil contains, or can be amended to contain, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a long list of micronutrients that plants need to build tissue, produce chlorophyll, flower, and fruit. Function 4, gas exchange. Roots need oxygen too. Believe it or not, roots breathe. Soil that isn't compacted has air pockets that let oxygen reach the root zone, and it also allows carbon dioxide and other gases to escape. Function 5, it's home to a living ecosystem. Beneficial microbes, mycorrhizal fungi, earthworms, all of that biological activity helps break down organic matter into forms plants can use, and some of it directly protects plant roots from disease. Now here's the part that changes everything. None of those 5 functions actually require soil specifically. They require a system that performs those functions. Soil is just one way, a really good, low-tech, been-around-forever way of delivering all 5. But it's not the only way, and in some cases, it's not even the best way. Think about it like this. If I told you that you need a chair to sit down, that's not really true either. What you actually need is something that supports your body weight at the right height so you're not standing. A chair does that. So does a stool, a bench, a beanbag, even a sturdy box. The chair isn't the requirement, the function is the requirement. Soil is the chair. What a plant actually needs is the function. This is exactly the principle behind hydroponics, aquaponics, soil-free wicking systems, and a bunch of other methods that professional growers have been using for decades. You've probably eaten hydroponic lettuce or tomatoes from the supermarket without even realizing it, because a huge amount of commercial produce, especially leafy greens and tomatoes in places like the Netherlands, is grown this way. This isn't some fringe experimental idea. It's mainstream proven agricultural science that just hasn't made its way into the average backyard gardener's mindset yet. So with that reframe in mind, plants need functions, not soil specifically. I set out to actually test this myself. Not just read about it, not just repeat what I'd seen other people do, but run my own trials in my own garden, side by side with traditional soil growing, and see what actually happened. I tested 4 different soil-free approaches over the past growing season. Let me walk you through each one. The first method I tested is probably the one you've heard of even if you've never tried it. Hydroponics. Specifically, I used a version called Deep Water Culture, or DWC, because it's genuinely the simplest and cheapest way to get started. And I wanted this test to be something anyone watching could realistically replicate at home without spending a fortune. Here's how it works. You've got a container. I used a food-safe bucket filled with water. In that water, you dissolve a hydroponic nutrient solution, which is essentially all the minerals a plant needs in a form that's already dissolved and ready to absorb, no breakdown required. The plant sits in a net pot at the top, roots dangling down into the nutrient solution, and an air pump with an air stone constantly bubbles oxygen into the water so the roots don't drown or suffocate. Let's map this back to those 5 functions I talked about earlier. Physical support, the net pot, and a growing medium like clay pebbles or rock wool holds the plant upright. Water retention, well, the roots are literally sitting in water, so that one's covered pretty thoroughly. Nutrient delivery, the dissolved nutrient solution provides everything, and honestly with more precision than soil ever could, because I know exactly what's in that water. Gas exchange, that's what the air pump and air stone are for, keeping the water oxygenated so the roots can breathe. And the living ecosystem piece, and this is the one hydroponics genuinely skips, and I'll come back to that because it's not without trade-offs. I grew lettuce, basil, and a couple of cherry tomato plants in this system. The lettuce and basil were honestly shockingly good. Faster growth than anything I've grown in soil. I had harvestable lettuce in about 5 weeks from seedling, where in soil I'm usually looking at 7 to 8 weeks. The leaves were bigger, more tender, and the basil in particular was some of the most vigorous basil I've ever grown. No pest pressure either because there's no soil for soil-dwelling pests to live in. The cherry tomatoes were more of a mixed result, and I want to be honest about that because I'm not here to sell you on hydroponics being perfect. The plant itself grew fast and looked healthy, but I had to be extremely precise about the nutrient solution. Tomatoes have different nutritional needs at different growth stages, more nitrogen early on for leafy growth, then a shift toward more potassium and phosphorus once flowering starts. In soil, there's a buffering effect. The soil holds a reserve of nutrients and releases them gradually, so small mistakes in your fertilizing don't really show up. In hydroponics, there's no buffer. If your nutrient mix is off, the plant tells you within days, sometimes hours. I actually got a mild nutrient lockout early on because my pH drifted too high, and I saw yellowing on the lower leaves before I caught it and corrected it. So here's my honest take on hydroponics after this test. For leafy greens and herbs, it's arguably better than soil. Faster, cleaner, more productive, and a smaller footprint. For fruiting plants like tomatoes, it works, but it demands more attention and precision than soil does. It's not necessarily harder, but it is less forgiving. Cost-wise, my basic bucket DWC setup cost me under $50, including the air pump, and I could easily scale it up with more buckets for next to nothing per unit after that first purchase. The second method takes hydroponics and adds a completely different twist: fish. Aquaponics combines a fish tank with a plant growing bed in a closed loop. The fish produce waste, which is basically ammonia. Beneficial bacteria in the system convert that ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates, which is a form of nitrogen plants can actually absorb. Water gets pumped from the fish tank up into the grow bed. The plants take up the nutrients and filter the water in the process, and the cleaned water flows back down to the fish tank. Everybody wins. The fish get clean water, the plants get fed, and you get vegetables, and if you're set up for it, fish as well. I used a fairly small setup for this test, a couple of 100-liter tanks stocked with some hardy fish, connected to a media-based grow bed filled with expanded clay pebbles rather than soil. Mapping the 5 functions again, physical support comes from the clay pebble media. Water. Obviously, the whole system is water-based. Nutrients come from fish waste processed by bacteria, which is a genuinely elegant, low-input way to fertilize plants. You're not buying nutrient solution at all. The fish are doing that job for free as a byproduct of just being fish. Gas exchange happens because the clay pebbles create air gaps and the water flow keeps things oxygenated. And here's the interesting one. The living ecosystem function is actually stronger in aquaponics than in plain hydroponics because you've got that whole bacterial colony doing real biological work, plus whatever beneficial organisms establish themselves in the grow media over time. I grew silver beet, kale, and capsicum in the aquaponics bed. The leafy greens performed almost as well as the hydroponic setup, strong, consistent growth, though slightly slower than the pure hydroponic lettuce because the nutrient concentration from fish waste alone tends to be gentler and less concentrated than a dialed-in hydroponic solution. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Plants weren't stressed at any point. Growth was just steadier rather than explosive. The capsicum genuinely surprised me. It thrived. I think this is because the clay pebble media gives roots more physical stability and a slightly more buffered, gradual nutrient environment than straight water culture, which fruiting plants seem to appreciate. I got a full, healthy harvest of capsicums that were, if anything, slightly sweeter than my soil-grown ones from the same season, though that's a subjective taste comparison, and I wouldn't stake my reputation on it being scientifically rigorous. The real cost here isn't money, it's setup complexity and time. You need to cycle a new aquaponic system for several weeks before it's ready to support plants, because that bacterial colony needs time to establish. If you rush it, ammonia builds up and can harm the fish before the bacteria are doing their job properly. This is genuinely the most involved of the 4 methods I tested, but it's also the one that produces food and potentially protein from fish in the same footprint, which is a compelling proposition for anyone thinking about self-sufficiency in a serious way. The third method is the one I think will surprise the most people watching, because it looks and feels the most like normal gardening, but there's genuinely no soil involved anywhere in the process. This is a wicking bed, but instead of filling it with traditional garden soil, I filled it with a mix of coarse coco coir, perlite, and well-rotted straw. None of that is soil. Soil, technically speaking, is a specific thing. It's mineral particles like sand, silt, and clay, combined with organic matter, air, water, and living organisms that has formed over a long period of time through weathering and biological processes. Coco coir is coconut husk fiber. Perlite is volcanic glass that's been heated until it pops, like a mineral popcorn. Straw is just dried plant stems. None of these are soil. But together, they can absolutely do everything soil does. Here's how the wicking part works, because this is honestly one of my favorite growing techniques regardless of soil or no soil. At the base of the bed, there's a water reservoir. I used a layer of gravel and a sealed liner to create a pocket. A pipe lets you fill that reservoir directly. Above the reservoir sits a layer of coarse material that lets water wick upward through capillary action, kind of like how a paper towel soaks up water if you dip just the corner in. Above that sits the growing layer, my coco coir, perlite, and rotted straw mix, where the plant roots actually live. The beauty of a wicking bed is that the plant essentially waters itself from below, drawing up exactly as much moisture as it needs, which means far less water waste and far less risk of overwatering, because there's nowhere for excess water to sit around the root crown and cause rot. For nutrients in this system, I mixed in a slow-release organic fertilizer and worm castings into the coco coir and straw blend before planting. Again, none of this is soil. It's organic amendments mixed into an inert-ish base medium. I planted a full mixed vegetable bed here, zucchini, beans, silver beet, and a couple of pumpkin vines that I let trail out over the edge. This was, without exaggeration, one of the most productive garden beds I've grown in years. The zucchini plants were enormous and produced consistently for months. The beans climbed and cropped heavily. The pumpkin vines sprawled out and gave me several good-sized pumpkins by the end of the season. Honestly, if I hadn't built this bed myself and knew exactly what was in it, you could have shown me photos of this bed and I would have assumed it was a normal, well-maintained soil garden bed. Why did this work so well? I think it comes back to those 5 functions again, but this time nearly all of them are being handled by materials that just happen to resemble what soil does without technically being soil. Coco, coir, and rotted straw hold moisture beautifully, arguably better than a lot of native soils, which can be sandy and free-draining or heavy clay that gets waterlogged. Perlite keeps the whole mix light and aerated, so oxygen reaches the roots easily, solving that gas exchange function really well. The organic amendments and worm castings handle nutrition. And because I used organic materials like straw and coir, which do break down over time and support microbial life, I actually got a decent version of that 5th function too, a living ecosystem, even though I started with 0 actual soil. This is genuinely the method I'd recommend to most backyard gardeners who want to try soil-free growing but aren't ready to commit to pumps, tanks, and electronic nutrient dosing. It looks and behaves the most like a traditional garden, but it sidesteps every problem that comes with bad native soil, contamination, poor drainage, compaction, whatever issue you might be dealing with in the ground beneath your feet. The 4th and final method I tested is the most minimalist of the bunch. Growing in pure inert media in containers, with all nutrition coming exclusively from liquid feeding, similar in spirit to hydroponics but without the standing water or pumps. I used a blend of perlite and coarse vermiculite. both mineral-based, both containing zero organic matter and zero inherent fertility whatsoever. This mix has one job: hold the plant upright and let water and air move through it freely. Every single nutrient the plant receives comes from a liquid feed I water in on a regular schedule. I grew a mix of herbs and a couple of dwarf tomato varieties in this setup, mainly because I wanted to test whether this approach, genuinely the simplest, cheapest, most low-tech version of soil-free growing, could work for someone in an apartment with just a sunny windowsill or balcony and zero interest in building pumps or tanks. The herbs did well, similar to the hydroponic results, though growth was slightly slower than the DWC bucket system because nutrients aren't constantly available in solution. They're delivered in pulses whenever I water and feed, rather than the roots sitting in a continuous nutrient bath. The dwarf tomatoes were solid performers, producing a reasonable crop, though again this method demanded consistency from me. Miss a feeding for too long and the plants show it fast, because there's genuinely nothing in that inert media holding any reserve nutrition at all. What I like about this method is its sheer accessibility. No pumps, no tanks, no electricity required at all if you don't mind hand watering. Just a container, an inert mix you can buy in a bag from most garden centers, and a bottle of liquid plant food. This is genuinely the lowest barrier entry point into soil-free growing that exists, and it's the one I'd point an absolute beginner toward if all four of these felt overwhelming. So let's bring this all together because I promised you proof, not just an explanation of the theory. Across every single method I tested, plants grew, genuinely grew, fruited, and produced harvestable food without ever touching soil. In several cases, particularly with leafy greens in hydroponics and the mixed vegetable bed in the wicking system, the results matched or exceeded what I typically get from traditional soil gardening in the same season. Let me give you the honest breakdown of what I'd tell a friend if they asked me which method to choose. If you want speed and don't mind close attention to detail, hydroponic deep water culture is unbeatable for leafy greens and herbs. If you're interested in a more complete, low-input, closed-loop system and don't mind a longer setup time, Aquaponics gives you plants and potentially fish from the same footprint, and it's genuinely one of the most satisfying systems to run once it's established. If you want something that looks, feels, and behaves like normal gardening but sidesteps bad soil entirely, the no-dig wicking bed with coco coir, perlite, and straw is, in my opinion, the best all-rounder for most backyard growers. And if you've got minimal space, minimal budget, and just want to prove to yourself that this actually works, the simple inert media container method with liquid feeding is the easiest possible entry point. None of these are better than soil gardening in some absolute sense. What they are is proof that soil is not a requirement. It's one option among several, and depending on your situation, bad native soil, contaminated ground, no backyard at all, water restrictions, whatever it might be, one of these alternatives might genuinely serve you better. Now, I don't want to give you an unrealistically rosy picture because I made mistakes across all four of these methods, and I think the mistakes are actually more instructive than the wins. Mistake number one, I underestimated how quickly hydroponic systems respond to nutrient and pH imbalances. In soil, small mistakes get buffered and diluted. In water-based systems, mistakes show up fast, sometimes within a day or two. If you're moving into hydroponics or aquaponics, get a cheap pH and EC meter and actually use it regularly. Don't just eyeball it the way you might get away with in a soil garden. Mistake number two. With the aquaponics system, I rushed the initial cycling period because I was impatient to get plants in. This stressed my fish more than it needed to, and it delayed real plant growth by a couple of weeks because the bacterial colony wasn't fully established yet. Patience at the start of an aquaponics system pays off enormously later. Mistake number three. In the wicking bed, I initially used straw that wasn't sufficiently broken down, and it temporarily tied up nitrogen as it decomposed, which showed up as slight yellowing in my zucchini leaves early on. Well-rotted or partially composted straw works far better than fresh straw in this application. Lesson learned. Mistake number four. In the pure inert media containers, I missed a couple of feeding cycles during a particularly busy week, and the tomatoes noticeably stalled. This method has genuinely zero buffer, so if your schedule is unpredictable, this might not be the right soil-free method for you specifically. The wicking bed or aquaponics setup would tolerate your inconsistency far better. The overarching lesson across all of this, soil-free growing isn't necessarily harder than soil gardening, but it is less forgiving in certain ways and more forgiving in others. Soil hides your mistakes. These systems reveal them quickly, which honestly, once I reframed it that way, I started to see as an advantage rather than a downside, because it taught me faster than years of soil gardening ever did about what a plant actually needs and when. I want to be upfront about who I think benefits most from soil-free growing, because it's not automatically the right choice for everyone. If you've got genuinely poor native soil, heavy clay, contaminated urban soil, extremely sandy or saline ground, soil-free methods let you completely sidestep that problem rather than spending years amending soil that might never fully recover. If you're growing in a small space with no access to real ground at all, a balcony, a rooftop, a windowsill, several of these methods, especially the simple container approach and small-scale hydroponics, let you grow real food in spaces that traditional gardening simply can't use. If water is scarce where you live, wicking beds in particular are dramatically more water efficient than traditional soil beds, because almost none of the water is lost to evaporation from the surface or to runoff. And if you're simply curious and want to understand your plants better, I'd argue that trying at least one soil-free method, even on a small scale, will teach you more about plant biology in a single season than years of traditional gardening, purely because these systems force you to understand what's actually happening at the root level instead of letting soil quietly handle it in the background. On the other hand, if you already have great soil, plenty of space, and you enjoy the traditional process of building and feeding a soil garden, there's no reason to abandon that. Soil gardening has advantages too, particularly around long-term sustainability, biodiversity, and honestly simplicity once a soil system is well established. This isn't an argument that soil is bad. It's an argument that soil isn't the only option, and for a lot of people watching this video, one of these alternatives might solve a problem that traditional gardening never could. If any of this has sparked your interest, here's exactly how I'd suggest starting based on which situation matches you. If you want the absolute simplest starting point, go with the inert media container method. Buy a bag of perlite and vermiculite, or even just a soil-free seed-raising mix if you want something pre-blended, get a container with drainage, and pick up a bottle of liquid vegetable fertilizer from any garden center. Plant a lettuce, a herb, or a dwarf tomato, follow the feeding instructions on the bottle, and watch what happens. Total cost well under $20 if you already have a container. If you want to try hydroponics specifically, a basic deep water culture bucket kit costs very little to assemble yourself, a food-safe bucket, a net pot, an aquarium air pump and air stone, and a bag of hydroponic nutrient solution. Start with lettuce or basil, because they're the most forgiving and fastest to show results, which will keep you motivated while you learn the ropes. If you've got an existing raised bed and want to convert it, or you're building a new one, the no-dig wicking bed approach is probably your best bet. You don't need to buy exotic materials. Coco coir bricks are cheap and widely available. Perlite is inexpensive, and well-rotted straw or spent mushroom compost can often be sourced locally for next to nothing. Layer your reservoir, your wicking layer, and your growing mix, and plant into it exactly like you would a normal garden bed. And if aquaponics genuinely excites you, my honest advice is to start smaller than you think you need to. A small tank with a handful of hardy fish and a modest grow bed will teach you the fundamentals of cycling, water chemistry, and system balance without the cost or risk of a large-scale setup. Get comfortable at that scale before you think about expanding. Whichever method you choose, my single biggest piece of advice is this. Don't try to convert your entire growing space at once. Pick one bed, one container, or one small system, run it alongside your existing soil garden for a full season, and genuinely compare the results with your own eyes. That's exactly what I did, and it's why I can stand here and tell you with confidence that this works, because I didn't take anyone else's word for it. I tested it myself, in my own backyard, against my own soil garden, side by side. So there you have it, real proof from my own garden that soil is not the essential ingredient we've all been told it is. It's one very good option among several, and once you understand what a plant actually needs, support, water, nutrients, oxygen, and ideally some biological life around its roots, you can meet those needs in all sorts of creative ways that have nothing to do with dirt. I'll be doing full deep dive videos on each of these 4 methods individually with complete build guides, exact costs, and ongoing updates on how they perform over a full year. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those. I'd genuinely love to know in the comments, which of these 4 methods surprised you the most? And is there one you'd actually want to try in your own space? Let me know down below, and I'll answer as many as I can. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.